África y América Latina comparten mucho en común históricamente, pero existe un vacío inmenso y un desconocimiento mutuo entre estos dos espacios debido a la insuficiencia, mejor dicho, a la falta de proyectos de intercambio entre ellos. Las impresiones que uno tiene del otro son basadas en lo que la autora nigeriana Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie llama el peligro de la single story, que termina caricaturizando a una realidad compleja. Con la edición 2021 del programa llamado La Literatura Hoy, que organiza la Biblioteca Luis Ángel Arango con autoras y autores africanos, planteamos que los intercambios a nivel literario pueden contribuir a un mejor entendimiento de las relaciones entre las realidades de nuestros dos continentes. Hoy tenemos como invitada la autora Tsitsi Dangarembga. Tsitsi Dangarembga es una novelista, cineasta y documentalista zimbabuense. Nació en Zimbabue, pero pasó una parte de su infancia en Gran Bretaña. Es sin duda una de las autoras más conocidas y reconocidas del continente africano, no solamente porque fue la primera mujer negra de su país a publicar una novela en inglés, pero porque sus obras han atraído bastantes análisis científicos por su cualidad estética, ética y la profundidad con que trata temas cruciales como la memoria, la violencia, la ciudadanía, las relaciones raciales y genéricas, sin olvidar la dura tarea de la construcción de una nación inclusiva después de una guerra de liberación, como fue el caso en Zimbabue y en muchas otras naciones africanas. Sus obras más leídas incluyen la trilogía Nervous Conditions, Condiciones Nerviosas, publicada en 1988, The Book of Notes, publicado en 2006, This Mournable Body, publicado en 2018. Un año después de publicar su primera novela que ganó el premio de escritores de la Commonwealth, Tsitsi se fue para Alemania con el objetivo de estudiar cinematografía en la Academia Alemana de Película y de Televisión. Desde luego, enriqueció su perfil con una lista rica de producciones tales como Nera, I Want a Wedding, Elephant People, Growing Stronger, Kare Svako, y con estas películas ganó múltiples premios a nivel internacional como a nivel nacional, por supuesto. Esas películas, digamos, ha sido una pintura de la realidad zimbabuense, una realidad en una sociedad postguerra, sobre todo. Muy recientemente, su novela This Mournable Body figuró en el shortlist de Booker Prize. Ella es la ganadora de PEN International Award for Freedom of Expression del año 2021 por su defensa de derechos humanos. Welcome, Tsitsi Dangarembga, for this interview.
Thank you, Gilbert.
It's a wonderful pleasure for me to be able to interview. I know you have a very busy schedule as a renowned author, but we are grateful that you accepted our invitation to contribute to this transatlantic literary dialogue. We are going to have a discussion around your works, around the context in which they are produced, they are written, in order to throw light on certain similarities, but also divergences in literary works, on Africa, on the African continent, but also on the Latin American continent, and what kind of dialogues we can, engage with when it concerns literatures from these two spaces. I will begin with a very simple question, Tsitsi. You've had a very commendable list of publications, literary works, but also in film. But let us start with what we know you for. Of course, Tsitsi Dangarembga, the author of Nervous Condition. That was like a boom, but I want to ask you a simple question. Why do you write? I mean, what does it mean to write to you? I've had the privilege of talking with a number of African authors or reading about them. With Ngugi, he told me to write is to be at the battlefront. And with someone like Sonny Labotansi from the Congo, whom you know, He said to write for him is to breathe, is an act of breathing. And then with somebody like Ayikwe Arma, he responds very ironically, or I would say sarcastically, to the question, why does he write? And he says he writes to showcase his importance, for for direct action. That he writes because he failed to act, directly to influence society. Why do you write in your own case, Tsitsi?
Gilbert, I began writing in order to fill gaps. When I grew up, I did not see girls like I was in literature. And I was always reading about people who looked different to me, who had different lives to me. So my head was filled with stories of people who were not like me that I got from books. And as I grew up, I realized that this was a situation that I had to engage with to change it, because I felt that it was important for people to grow up reading stories about themselves. When you read about yourself, you feel seen. You feel that your place in the world is recognized. It helps you to think through your own life and to understand the things that you see around you. And so this was what I wanted to do when I started writing, a kind of translation of experience into story.
Thanks very much. And you began writing, at least as far as we know, your first published work was Nervous Condition. Of course, we know what is published might not necessarily be what has been, much work was done upstream, before you even publish it. So, but that is the first work that you published. And it put the question of gender relations at the center. I want to know, because sometimes critics might divert, the meanings of works. I want to know from you, the author, if when at the time you were writing or at the time you published this work, you meant it. Did you mean it to be read as a feminist text?
Gilbert, the first publication that I had was in Zimbabwe, and it was a play called She No Longer Weeps. And this play was about a young girl at university here in Zimbabwe who becomes pregnant, and the man leaves her to bring up the child on her own, and she never forgives him. So that was the play. It was only published in Zimbabwe, so it wasn't published internationally. That is why people do not know it. But that was my first publication. And it's important for me to say that, because you can see already the issue of women. Even Nervous Conditions, I took the character as a young girl who was struggling to go to school. So issues of women are important to me because I am a woman. I think to myself, if I do not stand up and speak up for the issues that affect women, who do I think is going to do that? If I do not tell the stories of women, who can I expect to tell them in the way that comes from a woman's perspective? If people think that is feminist, then that's fine.
Thank you. Thanks very much. It's quite interesting, and that's the reason why I was asking, because critics have noted that, and I also make that realization. I also make the same remark when I read your text, and it's actually a text about a female child growing up trying to assert herself, and Tambo believes that education is the way forward. It's what would give her a sense of self-realization, but her cousin has a different perspective, because she's more integrative of the kind of education that that the system inculcates into young Zimbabweans, especially the women. And so her assertiveness and her ability to pose questions brings her into conflict with her father, Baba Mukuru. But then there is politics at the level of the family. Of course, I'm not trying to reduce politics, I mean, to like the pure political sphere of government politics, but one wonders why, for a novel published, within the decade of Zimbabwean independence, hard politics, is some sort of, it's some sort of, implicit. It doesn't come out clearly in that first novel, of the, trilogy. Of course, politics actually becomes central in the Book of Notes and This Mournable Body. Was it, an expressed or, a vehement decision for you to some sort of push politics to the background and then, bring the issue of, female representation to the fore in that text?
Gilbert, you are quite correct. I have two young girl characters in the book. The protagonist is called Tambu, and she comes from a rural situation, an impoverished family, and she has to struggle to be educated as a girl in this environment. The other character is called Nyasha, and this is Tambu's cousin. And she comes from a wealthier family. Her family is educated, her parents work. And so at some point, Tambudzai comes to live with Nyasha. And Tambudzai only wants to get educated. But Nyasha was in England at some point when her parents were studying. So she understands more of the world. And she sees things differently from Tambudzai. And she tries to warn Tambudzai that, yes, education is good, but you have to be careful because it is education in a particular system. It is not education for you. It is education to make you useful for people who have power. And at that time, the people who had power were the colonial people. So for me, that is a political message. So I don't think that I was putting politics, uh, putting it in the background. I feel that there are different ways of engaging with issues. And for me, it is always important to engage with issues at the level of individual experience, because I believe that is how people can really be touched by the novel. Other people write differently, and that's fine. But my purpose is really to engage with people at the emotional level, at least so far. That's what my writing has done. So my intention has always been to show a character moving through their world. And that world inevitably involves politics. The thing about Nervous Conditions, though, is that the characters were young and it's written in the first person. So it is taken from a young person's perspective. So the reason why politics becomes more overt in the other two novels is that the character is growing up and is also more able to see the political connections, the direct political connections.
That's a very interesting and convincing response to my question. And then now, again, still on the level, I mean, at the level of the kind of politics that you engage with in the text, critics have insinuated that the title of your work, Nervous Condition, has to do with a reference to, I mean, similar expression in Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. That the condition of the native, in the colonial setting, is a nervous condition, and so there's an argument that says you were some sort of writing back. Of course, Frantz Fanon is a decolonial thinker. I mean, of course, post-colonial and decolonial thinker, and but there's always a criticism that he never at least approached the feminist dimension or like the gender relations, in his philosophy of liberation. And so there's a feeling that you wanted to remind him, of course, he's no more alive, but I mean, to actually inflect, that philosophy of liberation, which is to an extent masculinist, and you wanted to give that dimension of the feminist dimension of liberation, you know. because there's always a possibility that even though we might have a situation of liberation, liberation might paradoxically lead to imprisonment or further imprisonment of a particular segment of the society. It could be based on class, based on gender, or based on age, for that matter. So you want it to, to actually inflect some sort of masculinist reading of liberation by focusing on the aspect of gender.
Yes, Gilbert. Nervous Conditions, the title of my first novel, is taken from an introduction to Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. And the introduction was written by Jean-Paul Sartre. And indeed, I wanted to echo that thought that the situation of being colonized imposes great stresses on everybody. And my intention was to say that these stresses are felt by different people in different ways according to what their position in that colonized system is. So when you read Nervous Conditions carefully, one can question the behavior of Tambu's uncle who pays for her education. There are some ways of behaving that he exhibits that are very extreme. And if one really looks at the situation that he was in as a colonized person, the only one who had been educated in his family, so now responsible for the extended family, one can see that that is a situation that puts him in a lot of stress. He has to behave in ways that satisfy the colonial system, but he has to behave in ways that enable his family to develop into whole human beings. And he himself has got his own colonial burden that he is carrying. And for the women characters, the female characters, the situation is very clear. And so Nervous Conditions applies to all of them. I had not really engaged intellectually with colonial thought and post-colonial thought and decoloniality at that time. I studied psychology, but a cousin of mine had given me The Wretched of the Earth. And so I think I read it as a psychologist, and it really fitted what I wanted to say. And it's only looking back that I can see that my novel could be interpreted as opening up the space of the discourse of liberation to include women. And in fact, this theme becomes more prominent in the next two books also, where the second book is about during the liberation struggle, and then the third book also has a theme of women who had been in the liberation struggle.
Exactly. Thanks so much. You've stressed on your, reading Frantz Fanon as a psychologist, and this is an aspect that I think makes your works very unique. The depth that you give to personality, to the characters, is actually very, very. It's quite unique. Like the way there's a certain density, in the way you present characters, and when one reads just the very first sentence of Nervous Condition, that's to say, I studied this book when I was doing my master's in Cameroon. That was 2006, and the first sentence is very telling. I was not sorry when my brother died. I would compare it to other very remarkable, beginnings of, like 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and many other texts that, like the very beginning, really like holds you spellbound to the text. And from that sentence, one already sees a very psychological dimension of somebody not responding with remorse to the death of a brother, and you're asking yourself, what went wrong? And so, so the idea of psychology for me is quite important, in looking at in examining any of your works, even your films, which I've been able to watch in the past months. So I mean, how does, your formation, your training as a psychologist really, influence your art, as a writer in particular, that psychological dimension? Why? I mean, how does it manifest, in the way you write,
Yes, Gilbert. In my writing, I am very concerned about the person. I am concerned about the individual. And this concern comes from the fact that the individual is the basic unit of society. The individual then joins with other individuals to form a group. The first group is the family, then there's the community, then these communities act in an area that maybe is the district, the province, and then we go up to the nation, and then the region, the continent, the globe. So my reading is that if we do not get this individual right, if we do not enable this individual to shine and be the best that this individual can be, we will never have societies that shine and that are the best that our societies can be. So for me, it's very important to look at the pressures that are exerted on this individual that prevent this individual from coming into its most positive form. I think that this is really very important for me also as a woman, a Black woman, an African woman, a Zimbabwean woman. Zimbabwe is going through crisis now. Uh, a woman who is living a post-colonial experience, having been in a colonized nation. Because the work of colonialism was essentially to deny the humanity of people like me. Along the axis of race. And so our humanity is not something that we have questioned as much, in my opinion, that we should question. How are we human beings? What is the best way for us to be human beings now? And I'm very concerned about this whole idea of politics because I feel that politics hijacks us. We put a lot of our energy into the political before we have looked at the units that are going to be engaging in the political. Unless we start having different people, different individuals, we cannot have different politics. And so for me, all transformation begins with transforming the person at the individual level. So this is what I bring to my literature.
Yeah, it's often said where there is conflict in the soul, there's conflict in the city. So the connection between the individual and the society at large. And you touched on something about we need to rethink our being, the human part of us. And I've written somewhere that human being is different from being human. Being human is a constant ethical struggle. It's not because we are human beings that we are automatically human. That's how I've put it somewhere. Thanks so much. And then for you, education is the basis. I mean, really plays a key role. But then the kind of education, and of course, you've talked about the colonial educational system and how it trains or it forms. Like it's a kind of subjectification. It forms an individual psychology in order to be subservient to the colonial system. Ngugi wa Thiong'o have talked about that. Of course, Frantz Fanon himself has talked about that. And one could characterize your work, Nervous Condition, of course, even the other books that form the trilogy as a Bildungsroman, as we call it in literary language. That's language, that's a text of personal development, of psychological, maturity, gaining consciousness of oneself and society. And if you look at, the paradigm of Bildungsroman in African literature, be it Kamara Laye's The African Child, be it Bernard Dadier's Klimbié, be it Ngugi wa Thiong'o's memoirs, Dreams in a Time of War, or his autobiographical novel, Weep Not Child, education is really key to the protagonist's dream of a better future. And then, but again, you put to question, the kind of education, as in Tambo's case, and that is what makes, Nyasha a very central, like character in the text, because she's able to question the kind of education that is, made available to her. But again, what you question is not just the education that one gets at school, that's formal education, but also the education that one gets at home. And I think in that sense, you also cast a critical gaze at our cultures, because if you look at the way Tambo, and the brother Namo are actually brought up. I mean, like, one is, being brought up to feel that he is a king and has priority, has privilege, while Tambo, is there to serve the brother and becomes some sort of, I would say, a slave, to the brother. So did you also mean to criticize or to point out that there are aspects of our culture that we need to also revisit in that sense?
Definitely, Gilbert. I did want to point out in nervous conditions that there are aspects of our culture that we need to revisit. I believe that culture is dynamic. Just as the conditions that we live in change of necessity, nothing ever remains the same. So I think culture has to be part of that change, that process of transformation. And I feel that as Africans, we often look back to our culture. We create this wonderful pre-colonial utopia in which everything was wonderful. And of course, there were things that functioned because it was a system that worked. But that does not mean to say that those elements of that system will function well when they are transposed into 2 centuries later. Also, it's important, I think, for us as Africans to realize that a lot of what we call our culture has been retold to us by the colonialists, because they are the ones who came and started asking questions and writing things down. So a lot of the things that were codified by the colonialists as customary or traditional law were just ideas that they got when they came to speak to people. And definitely in this part of the world, in southern Africa, there was a particular British colonialist who would only speak to men. So he would go out to an area, the British would say that one of the chief is the friendly chief who had power over the other chiefs and acted as a go-between. And then in this scenario where this particular chief had been made paramount over the others, they would then gather the men. The women were not spoken to. And they would say to the men, "What is your life like? Because I want to write it down into law now." So the men had a wonderful time. My life is like this, my wife does that for me, and the women do that. So actually, what we believe is our tradition is often distorted. Of course, we have oral accounts, but even oral accounts will be affected by those kinds of actions that are happening in the community. And so I feel we have to be a little more critical about how we look at tradition and how we think it can be relevant for today. I think we really have to start by looking at what is necessary today to create sustainable, functioning nations. And there are things that maybe cannot be carried forward that were wonderful practices at one time. Let's memorialize them. Let's have days where we do certain things in honor of what we used to do. But let's remember that we have moved on a couple of centuries and it's a global world now. Um, I believe that that's a pragmatic approach to the problem. So I think that it is necessary to reevaluate traditions from time to time.
Okay. I would remain with the issue of education because it is central in Tambo's development. The three novels that constitute the trilogy actually touch. I mean, each one of them is a phase of Tambo's educational life. And this is quite interesting because Zimbabwe is usually presented as an example. And I've talked with Zimbabwean scholars who are very convinced that Robert Mugabe's legacy actually has to do with education. Uh, I mean, who really say Zimbabwe has kind of a privileged status when it comes to the question of education. But then when one reads through your text, there's necessity to actually nuance this kind of maybe romantic or over romantic regard or reading of that the Zimbabwean educational system. Now, if one says Nevo's condition is set, like in the period during the struggle, of course, the later novels actually, also approach, post-independence life. But again, you still hammer very strongly on the nature of education and the crisis of education in Zimbabwe. How does one understand this paradox? No.
Gilbert, education in the colonial era was the key to a better life. So investing in education was really not a quest for knowledge. It was a very pragmatic, material pursuit. You simply wanted to have a better life so you could eat better, you could keep your body warm, you could go to the doctor and get medicine if you were ill, you had good shelter. So I think that is really important to understand the difference of education as an instrument for material comforts and education as an intellectual, almost metaphysical, if you like, pursuit in search of knowledge. And I do not really think that African people in Zimbabwe were encouraged to pursue education for the sake of knowledge. I think that is something that's beginning to happen now as people see that, oh, this education that we got in this paradigm has not actually helped us to solve the big issues that need to be solved. So we need another approach to how we assimilate knowledge and how we use knowledge that we have assimilated. And again, this was very much part of the colonial project that education should be instrumental only for the colonial system. And because the colonial project needed Africans educated up to a certain point where they could do certain tasks, this is the education that they made available. And so we, as the African people, thought education was about doing certain tasks that you were told to do and being able to do them. It began with like clerical work. The colonialists needed clerks for their activities. Then, as the communities grew, they needed people to teach. So then they allowed people to be teachers. Then they decided that health also needed to be expanded. So then people were encouraged to be doctors. This is why the professions became so important. And at that point, it was the service professions, as you can see, not even the creative professions, such as engineering, architecture. All of that came much later. And so I think our understanding of education has also evolved in those kinds of steps. And it is only now that we see that we need an expanded idea of what education is. The result of that is that people in a colonial system of education can become very good at tasks that are based on repeating information. It's a process that I call emparrotment, a kind of intellectual emparrotment. You just repeat that thing again and again, but you don't expand your mind to let in new things and give out new things. The creative aspect, you do not inquire the scientific aspect. And if you look at the colonial documents, you will see that the idea of Bantu education actually stated that issues of science and creativity were not to be taught and fostered in the African schools. And so this is why we have this strange situation with education in Zimbabwe. There was a time when education in Zimbabwe really gave us the basics, but it did not free our minds to inquire and to create what is necessary for ourselves. That process is beginning now. I believe that the ZANU-PF government began to see that process happening after independence, and then they realized that, oh, this isn't a good way to hold on to power.
Yeah.
So we'd better not encourage this process. And this is why you see now that people get scholarships if they're aligned to government, but other people are not exposed to that because they've seen that education has to be manipulated in order to hold on to power, just like the colonial people did.
Okay. Usually, one would seek to delink, or I mean, most authors are somewhat negate when one claims that there are autobiographical elements in their works. Looking at your trajectory, Tsitsi, and looking at the character Tambo in these three novels, in particular, I see connections. But even as a critic, I'm not in a rush to say these are autobiographical texts because, again, credit to your way, I mean, to your ability to paint, the psychological, interiority of the character. One doesn't find it, I mean, something easy to say this is the author's life. I mean, it doesn't. Because of the way you do that authentically, I mean, like really like giving the characters their own independence, makes me not to rush to say these are autobiographical texts. But again, there are connections at the macro level. You come from a family with a track record of being pioneers. I've read that your mom was the first lady to have a bachelor's degree in Zimbabwe, the first Black woman to have a bachelor's degree in Zimbabwe. And you were the first to publish a novel in English language in Zimbabwe. And so there's a track record, about their family with regards to education. So I was wondering, but again, I see you as a successful person. But again, the way you paint your characters, one would sense a certain level of pessimism, yeah, maybe it gets a bit complex in this mournable body, but I think Tambo is a very, I would say, complex character, bordering on self-doubt, on some sort of schizophrenia. She's caught in between two cultures, some sort of doesn't belong to neither of them, doesn't know her mother tongue anymore. But still, despite all her attempts and the belief that through a good performance, she will make it, in a dominantly white system. And so these characters end up, like in a very difficult situation of non-appertenance to neither of the two worlds. But I mean, how do you reconcile that successful, at least as we know it, you are a successful author, successful, I mean, I would say public figure in Zimbabwe, with the tendency to be rather cynical, in projecting your main characters in the three novels?
Yes, that is a very good question to ask me. About the autobiographical aspects, I believe that there has to be a bit of yourself in anything that you produce. If you do not have the potential to produce that thing, how can you produce it? And how can you have that potential if it is not within you? So for me, it doesn't really matter what people think. My intention is to write characters that people in my part of the world recognize and go on journeys with. That is the most important thing to me, because that is what happened when I used to read books when I was young, until I suddenly realized that, oh, but these are all about characters who have nothing to do with me or very little. These are all about places that I do not find my own body in. And so it was important for me to synthesize that process of recognition. That might change. At the moment, I'm writing a young adult dystopian speculative fiction. So I'll be interested to know whether there are any autobiographical elements in that. There might be, because as I said, it's coming from me. And so I think whether it's autobiographical or bio or not is something that is a nice academic question. But for me as the writer, it shouldn't influence my writing what I think is a good novel. In terms of the trajectory of the characters, when I wrote Nervous Conditions, I truly did not believe that I would end up writing the Tambudzai that we find in this mournable body. But success has become a very complicated condition in Zimbabwe at the moment, with the kind of political, social, and economic setup that we have. More and more, we find that successful people can almost only be successful if they are aligned to government, or else if they are aligned to some other center of power, maybe a foreign government that has that gives money to an NGO. There has been little space left for the people to act privately and achieve success. And I think this is a very unfortunate situation. On the other hand, education was telling us, go and become yourself, do your own thing, be successful in your own right. So we have a whole generation of people who are caught in the middle, who just don't know what to do anymore. And as I was writing this vulnerable body, I had to ask myself, what does success look like? Does it really look like going into business where you know that there is nothing but corruption, where you have to close your eyes to the situation that is on the ground for millions of other people in the country? What does success look like? And this is why at the end, my protagonist, Tambudzai, gives up a job that pays her well, that allows her to have a house, to go back to work with family members. And for me, I was saying that this idea that you can do anything to get yourself a comfortable life may not lead to success at the end of the day, because you have to have a successful society in which to be successful.
Yeah.
Otherwise, your success is precarious and it turns into another burden that you have to carry on your back because you're afraid that people are going to be wanting to steal it away from you. So this idea of going back and creating community together was what I called success, and Tambudzai did it.
Well, that's quite interesting, really. That individual success can become a burden, when it's not, in the context of a collective, endeavor. Yeah. So I was saying that in your second novel, the Book of Not, is when you really, portray, the intricacies of the struggle that is going on in Zimbabwe at the time, and this struggle is some sort of swept under the carpet, by the educational system. I mean, by the white society doesn't allow the students, at least those for example, those in the Sacred Heart College, to know what is going on. So that's part of the history, of a nation that is not made known to the young citizens of that nation, and there's even, inability to call that what is happening by its rightful name. I mean, like, it's in Zimbabwean history, it's referred to as the Chimurenga. That's the war, the struggle. And what happens at the time is the second Chimurenga, like the second wave of the struggle, of course, taking into cognizance a previous, a liberation by Zimbabweans against British colonialism, against Tsitsi Rhodes and his, cohorts. So what is happening at the time that you said the Book of Not is the second Chimurenga, but there's a lot of silence. There's a lot of silence, as to what people know about that war. And I was imagining what that means in the process of nation building. because we are thinking of a post-independent society where there's discourse of, reconciliation, racial equality, but then there's lack of knowledge of what actually happened. There's lack of knowledge about the scars sustained by part of the society, and you are very, very, meticulous in the way you paint it out so that it should not just be a part or the black suffering. I mean, like it's very, very nuanced the way you bring it out. That perpetrators and the dichotomy between victim and perpetrator is not so easily identifiable as people might want to think from a very Manichaean perspective. So I think in that sense, you are doing what Ngugi wa Thiong'o has done in A Grain of Wheat, by showing the complexity, of this struggle. So that in times of reconciliation, you should also think, neatly about what people went through, where the shoe pinches, where the scars are, in order to really engage, with post-war rebuilding, post-war reconstruction. So I was wondering, what do you situate? I mean, how do you look at literature, Zimbabwean literature, and its potential to contribute to nation building in context of post-war, in post-war context, in the case of Zimbabwe?
Gilbert, I agree with you entirely that literature should contribute to nation building. Literature and other forms of art are often said to be mirrors that we look into to see ourselves. And so, if I'm getting up in the morning and I look in the mirror and I see that my face is dirty, I go and wash my face. If I see that my clothes are not fitting, I change my clothes and I decide, okay, I'm going to go to the gym more. This is what mirrors are there for. They are there to also help us to be our better selves by looking at where we are not quite measuring up. Now, we find that this has not really been the case as much as I would like in Zimbabwe. First of all, when ZANU-PF became the ruling party in 1980, after our first elections, almost everybody in the southeastern part of the country that spoke one of the major languages was on the side of ZANU-PF. The situation was different in the west and the southwest of the country because that is another language group there. So because of this euphoria, nobody thought that things would go wrong. And it took us a long time to understand that things were not as we had thought they would be. In this time, a decade and a half or so, the government had been consolidating its structures. And one of the ways that it did that was to take control of narrative. Narrative was always controlled from colonial times. We had the Literature Bureau for the written word, and we had these film departments, film units within the Ministry of Information for cinematic expression. And so our government took that over. And so the idea was that, especially for writing, writing was going to valorize the liberation struggle and the exploits of the liberation fighters. And this is what happened. There were competitions and young people wrote and were given prizes and the things were published. And so again, people were establishing a trajectory of expression, and they did not encourage people to introspect. And at the same time, those guerrilla war tactics that the government had practiced during the liberation struggle were used in certain situations to ensure compliance from the people, often at election time. So the people began to realize that although we had independence, we had not had demilitarization. And people began to realize that it was not a situation in which one could tell certain stories. On top of that, at independence, we were simply told the war is over, we're all very happy. If we were enemies yesterday, we are now friends and co-nationals, and we are building our country together. It was like unity by decree. And of course, you cannot decree such things, especially when people were so terribly divided and where all the structures are pointing to disparity and not unity. And so I think because we did not have this process of national reckoning with the violence of war, we have not really established the foundations for nation. War is very violent. Guerrilla warfare is extremely violent in the sense that no one feels safe. Anything or anybody is a target. And so we have a very traumatized population. But all this has been put aside in the interest of promoting the narrative of the glorious revolution. So even if you go back to the first liberation struggle against the colonialists in 1896, 97, you will see the same thing, because now we talk about Mbuyane, which is wonderful, but we do not actually learn about the process of the war. We just have this figurehead, Mbuyane. So this is a tendency to glorify war and to glorify war as that process that generates nation.
Okay.
Whereas I think that war cannot generate anything. War can destroy what was there before and leave space to generate.
Exactly.
So if we now fill that space with more military narrative, we are actually not generating anything but the destruction, which is what war does. And I think these are issues that were not well thought through. And I think we will have to come to that moment of reckoning if we want to go forward. I don't know when it will be. I don't know how it will be. I would hope that the generations that are writing now in a digital age where there is more surveillance on our governments, I think it does hold them in check a little bit. I hope that those people will feel freer to investigate and explore many more issues than have been the case up until now. I think I was able to begin on that path because of taking the woman's perspective. So it was never directly engaging with those issues. But now, having lived in Zimbabwe for 2 decades solidly since 2000, I find that I am abutting on these issues every day. So I'll have to see what my next work will be like.
Interesting. I mean, what you've said is quite interesting, because I mean, like, even the nomenclature post-war itself needs to be deconstructed, because, as you said, I mean, the tactics of war have been carried on onto the sphere of politics, and such that politics becomes the continuation of war by other means, as I think Michel Foucault has pointed out somewhere. And also, like, the prevalence of certain discourses of the war over others, the state discourse, state version of events. And I think in Zimbabwe, it's the same party that has been, in power ever since. There was a semblance of power sharing, but of course we all know how that ended. That even brings me to the title of your third novel in that trilogy, This Mournable Body. It's quite interesting. I mean, that some bodies are mournable and others are not. That's what is implied in that title. And Tsitsi, I've done research on post-war Congo and post-war Peru, and I also developed a concept that is similar to this. What do you actually highlight with that title? I call it the neo-colonial cartography of sympathy, that certain bodies, when they are killed, elicit sympathy and others don't. Now, if you go to Congo, you discover that there are parts of Congo that have been surrendered to, have been considered to be war zones. So whatever happens in such zones don't affect life in the capital city. At the global level, Palestinian lives don't matter anymore. And Colombia also can be said to be a post-war society, of course, maintaining the quote, because it's coming, out of a war process. But again, violence still subsists in other forms. But of course, there's also the perception that when the war touches, certain strata of the society or certain sectors, it is felt much more than when others are allowed to, to bodies that are allowed to die, without arousing any form of sympathy, And so that title for me is very, it's an interpellation, really. It's an ethical interpellation. So I just want to, how did you arrive at that title, and what did you seek to achieve by, titling your text as such?
Yes, Gilbert. My title has two paths of genesis. The one which was immediate to the writing, and the one which was the culmination of my work and my observations and my reading, my inquiry. So the immediate path that brought me to that title was a comparison between two massacres, yes, two massacres that took place in two different countries. The first one was the Charlie Hebdo massacre in Paris, where the whole world was incensed. And there were hashtags, I am Charlie Hebdo, etc. It was like the whole world was mourning. And the other one occurred a few months later, and it was at Garissa in Kenya, at a university where a couple of hundred students were massacred. And it was as if it had hardly happened. I didn't see the hashtags, I didn't see the coverage on the news. And so for me, that was like a direct comparison that these bodies in France, which were white bodies, were mourned in this way. And these bodies in Kenya, black bodies, were hardly mourned. And this is something that I had come up against in my career as a filmmaker in my film studies, where I would watch different genres and engage with film theory to understand how bodies move through the medium of film. When you watch the Western, you see one white person mowing down hundreds and thousands of bodies of color. And this is not a cause for us to mourn. It is a moment for us to celebrate that the hero has managed to do this. And I can remember going to film screenings as a teenager, maybe 12, 13, 14, with a whole lot of other young people my age, and seeing people applauding and being happy when the hero massacred all these black bodies. And even then, I felt uncomfortable. And so then, as I began my studies in cinema, I began to understand how colonialism had constructed that narrative also. And I began especially to understand how colonialism reached its peak at the time that film, the celluloid film, was being developed as a means of making films, moving visual images. So the two have a very close history. And it was quite clear that this new technology would be deployed in the interests of empire. And so when this Charlie Hebdo moment came, and I looked back on what I had studied, and I had this character, Tambudzai, who was behaving in horrible ways, in ways that you would think, no, I don't want to have anything to do with a woman like this. It was important for me to say, let's stand still for a moment. Let's find out what it is that makes a person behave in such abominable ways. And let us remember that this is still a person. This is a person who has come to this position, but could easily have gone to another position if the circumstances had been different and more nurturing and more enabling. And so let us mourn the very fact of any person becoming so abject. That is really what I was saying. And I think that this can be applied even to our governments. Our governments are people who have been formed and constructed in certain ways, ways that were there to deny them, that often had to be met with violence, different kinds of violence. And so I think we need that fundamental understanding if we are going to go forward, that what the task we have is a task of reconstructing ourselves. You mentioned post-war, focusing on war as the origin of the trajectory. It is similar when you talk about decoloniality. We are still making the colonial experience the point of departure. So we need to reconstruct ourselves from a source that is not determined by the colonial experience. This is why people are going back to think of the pre-colonial era as utopian, when it was not. No place on earth is utopian. But we have got to construct something that works for us in the present, that looks forward to our future. Okay. And so these are the issues that I was endeavoring to bring into that notion of this mournable body.
Yeah, so usually we ask our guests to read a passage from one of their texts. So I want Tsitsi Dangarembga to read for us the last paragraph of the Book of Notes for us.
I thanked Mrs. May as warmly as I could, then made a great show of picking the slip of newsprint up and stowing it carefully in my bag to have the matter concluded. Miserably, I sidled off down the hall. What was I going to do now? Was there any way to go back to my job at the agency? Now that I was not wanted here, what would I do for accommodation? There was no longer a place for me with my relatives at the mission. I could not go back to the homestead where my sister Netsai hopped unspeakably on a single limb, and where my mother, Mai, would laugh at me daily. I had forgotten all the promises made to myself and Providence while I was young, concerning carrying forward with me the good and human, the Unu, of my life. As it was, I had not considered Unu at all, only my own calamities, since the contested days at the convent. So this evening, I walked emptily to the room I would soon vacate, wondering what future there was for me, a new Zimbabwean.
Yeah, I actually wanted you to read this passage because it sets the tone. I mean, it ends a novel, but already announces, the next text. And it's important because you find the character at the crossroads of family, school, education, and profession. She struggled all her life, to have self-fulfillment, to have good education and a good job. But at the end of the day, none of the above actually is within view, So she's struggling to reinvent herself, reconsidering her values, reconsidering even her education. And for me, it's quite important that question, which I think is what distinguishes literature from history, because if a historian makes an error, he can be forgiven. But if Tsitsi Dangarembga, makes a damning error in her novel, she will be judged more cruelly. And that's where literature actually is much more powerful. And there is this quest for a new Zimbabwean, and that quest is not yet over. So there's a constant quest for a new Cameroonian. It's not only about Zimbabwe here, it's just a metaphor for a new African. So that quest for personality, it ties very well with what you actually explained in the course of this discussion. Yeah. So thanks so much, Tsitsi, and it was a pleasure having you. And we hope to have such discussions on other platforms. Of course, still having to do with transatlantic connections. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Gilbert. Thank you for the invitation. It's wonderful to have this transatlantic connection.
Señoras y señores, hemos llegado al fin de nuestro diálogo y les agradecemos mucho. Hay que quedarse conectado a este canal porque tendríamos otras entrevistas con otros autores y otras autoras africanas y para posibilitar un diálogo a nivel transatlántico. Muchísimas gracias y sí, estamos conectados. Gracias.